Okay, let's talk about pigment. Color is confusing. And although I understand the basics, I'll admit my brain is having a hard time believing it. This part I do understand. Color only works when there is light. So, devoid of light, there's no color. The part that gets me is that objects themselves do not emit color. Instead, color is a product of reflected light particles. When light is cast on an object, the object absorbs most light particles. It's only the ones that they reflect that create the color we're seeing. Newton proved this in the 1600s, explaining that light is not a wavelength. It's made of particles. What is interesting is that he calls them corpuscles, which is a few letters off from the word corpuscles, which are frozen dead bodies. These also reflect light. So how does this come into play with art materials? Well, art materials rely entirely on pigments, whether it's a paint such as acrylic, watercolor, oil, colored pencils, pastels, crayons, you name it. Pigments are created in two ways. One is a product derived synthetically, using chemical reactions to create pigments. Others are derived from organic matter that can be mined or collected. Historically, premium pigments are notoriously expensive and hard to find. Some are mined in only specific areas, such as lapis lazuli, which can only be found in Afghanistan. Back in the day, Romans originally had to break open thousands of small sea snails that secreted murex. It sounds like something you take over the counter so you can stop blowing your nose. And this secreted murex was used as a purple dye. But when you break it down, most mediums are basically the same thing. It's pigment suspended in some sort of binder, which is what holds the whole thing together. Pigment without binder is practically useless. Throw it to the curb. They're not putting you through college. This is because pigment could never attach to anything. It's basically dust. Dust in the wind. Literally, because it can be rubbed or washed away very easily. So it needs a little something to turn it into a pliable medium. It's the binder that determines what the final product will be. And if it's paints or colored pencils, the pigments can be exactly the same, but the type and viscosity of the binder changes and will ultimately decide what type of medium you are going to end up with. Wax creates mediums like wax crayons, some colored pencils, oils make oil paints, oil pastels, oil-colored pencils. Watercolors are uniquely made from what is known as gum arabic. Gum arabic is derived from the sap of the acacia tree. There are other ingredients, and what's added to the mix depends on a lot of factors. 1, the type of supply being created. 2, how expensive certain ingredients are. And 3, the unique recipe that each company uses in their product lines. Watercolor has pigments and gum arabic as a binder, but there can be other additives. These tend to be referred to as chemicals. But rather than assume we're talking about bleach, you can instead think of them as just a substance that has been milled down to its purest form. And we should be thankful. Back in the day, artists like Da Vinci had to ward against consuming their paints, as they were extremely toxic, and one could die from consuming even the smallest amount. If you're like me, you end up with paint in your mouth from your hand or your paintbrush. But companies like Winsor & Newton are removing harsh chemicals like cadmium from their product lines. Thank you for keeping us clumsy folk safe. But these other additives can make the pigment more brilliant. It can make the pigment easier to handle, such as the additive of honey in some cases into watercolor pigments, which help with re-wetting pigments after they've been dried. Other chemicals can help the pigment disperse as it's thinned in water rather than clump and stick together. Unlike other binders, gum arabic is a relatively weak binder. This means it can only hold so much pigment before the pigment load becomes too heavy to adhere to a surface. Due to this, it can only handle a low pigment load, which is why watercolors are thinned down, and it gives them the luminance they're known for. Binders and these chemical additives, in and of themselves, aren't expensive. Sometimes there are ingredients added just to bring down the price of the final product. And there are a lot of products out there. So many. It is so easy to just reach out to something inexpensive and call it a day. But what are we really buying? The easy answer is filler. You aren't purchasing beautiful pigments and the highest quality binders in their purest forms. No. Crayola, Rose Art, Reeves. These brands aren't selling you paints or pencils, they're selling you fillers and extenders, which exist to take up space to convince you you're purchasing more than what you're really getting. No earth mine pigments here, only chemical imitations. Pigments, as I mentioned earlier, are probably the most expensive aspect to our materials. Any one recipe can contain up to 75% pigment, although this is reserved for only the finest materials. Some pigments are worth more than their weight in gold. That is, if you're actually purchasing real, mined from the earth pigment. And when you're reaching for something like Winsor & Newton or Daniel Smith, you can be sure that what you're reaching for is quality. But what does quality mean? Well, real, mined from the earth pigments that these brands are selling aren't selling just colors that look great now. They're selling colors that will be radiant not just now, but now and for centuries to come. This is known as light fastness. If a paint is light fast, it means this paint can sit by an open window being shined on for years and not lose the qualities that made that painting worth creating in the first place. So Crayola is not only using faux pigments, these chemicals aren't luminous, they don't mix well, and the colors won't last for more than a few weeks if left out for any length of time. That is what you're reaching for when you look for brands like Daniel Smith. You're better off purchasing the primaries of a good brand than skimping out and buying an assortment of inexpensive colors. Plenty of people peddle that expensive art materials don't make the artist, and while this is true, expensive art materials sure do make the whole experience so much more rewarding and successful. So, if I've taught you anything worth knowing today, please leave a like. Tell me what you liked about this video in the comments. And please, while you're here, hit that subscribe button for more educational videos. Right now, I'm probably talking to no one. But I really enjoy this whole YouTube thing, and I would like it to be more worth my time. I'm trying to put together more worthwhile content, and maybe one of these days I'll explain how hard it is for me to get videos out. But I do enjoy it, so I'm going to keep chugging away at this. Don't forget to check out mkdrawdaily.com.